Welcome everyone to the Women's Ironman World Championship Kona breakdown, where we had one of the most stacked start lists we'd ever seen in Kona for the women. And even though we had several favorites, nobody was entirely sure who was going to be on that podium, but we all for sure expected many fireworks throughout the day. But I don't think any of us could have predicted what was about to unfold. It was to be one of the most dramatic races we've ever seen. The start list was full of World Championship veterans looking to put another feather in their cap, but it was also full of rookies and debutantes who were looking to leave a mark and mix up the race. But in total, there were 54 women, a very full field that got into the water that morning. And it was fascinating being on the boat right at the start line here, because you could see women jostling for position, looking around where other athletes were. And I was having a hard time spotting Lucy in the front of that lineup till I realized she wasn't at the front at all. She was off chilling at the back on her own, away from everybody, moving back and forth. Nobody could predict where she was going to end up at the start line, which just shows so much confidence, which she rightly deserves, having led out this race many times before. And eventually, just minutes before the start, she ended up working her way to the front, but still moving around to keep people guessing as to where she would end up. It is also amazing that the women have to wait about 8 minutes from when they get into the water, treading water, anxiously waiting for that cannon to go off for what is the biggest race of the entire year. They've worked so hard for it. How would it turn out? Well, as that cannon went off, we can see that the race split apart into several groups at first. Everybody hoping to get on some good feet and make some good partnerships in the water, because the conditions weren't that ideal. It wasn't a glassy day at all. There was a good bit of chop and swell, and so having a good pair of feet in front of you to help break through that water was essential. Now, as expected, Lucy made the break at the front. A couple of women tried to hang on to her. It looked like Taylor and Holly were closest to her at first, but unfortunately for them, weren't able to hang on. But they probably weren't too fazed by that. They probably expected it. And sure enough, Lucy's gap began to grow. Taylor and Holly at first were the ones to lead out that front pack, to which they eventually took turns throughout the swim. Haley Chura then eventually getting involved later on. But at first, that first pack was really large, and it slowly but surely stretched out throughout the course of the swim. Rewinding a little bit to the start, and one of the most fascinating things that happened in the entire swim was Solveig Løvseth's start to the swim. She had to swim over a paddleboarder at the beginning who was in her way. A rough start for her, and eventually though, she managed to find herself in that second chase group alongside Kat Matthews and Laura Philipp. Although Kat Matthews, on the other hand, wouldn't have been ecstatic with that position, because that group would end up coming out of the water over 6 minutes back from Lucy. And we know she's put a lot of effort into that swim. She probably thinks she's a better swimmer overall than Laura. She came out closer to Lucy than that in 2023. So being in that position did put her on the back foot from the get-go. Laura, on the other hand, said she was really happy with her swim. After the race, she said it was actually the best part of her race. So yeah, a lot of different interesting dynamics right away in this swim. But that group with Taylor Knibb and Holly Lawrence and Haley Chura leading the way managed to keep the gap down to Lucy to a respectable minute and a half, which was pretty similar to what it was in Kona in 2023. For the perfect opportunity to get onto the bike and try catch up to Lucy. But the biggest surprise from that group was how good Chelsea Sodaro's swim was, to be right on the end of that pack, which meant she was a good few minutes up on the likes of Kat, Laura, and Solveig. So the swim overall was a lot like 2023. Lucy swam almost identical times to them, just a little bit faster, had a good transition, except for this part where she got snagged on Taylor's bike for a little bit. So not the quickest transition overall, which was good for those behind her, especially Holly Lawrence and Chelsea Sodaro, who had rapid transitions and got out onto the bike before Taylor Knibb. And they were probably thinking, this is actually a great start to this race. Lucy's only about a minute up at this point. The conditions are good, and we've got this huge pack to ride together with. Although at this point, Chelsea and Holly were complete unknowns for this race. Chelsea had had a really rocky season, and we hadn't seen her perform to her best that we'd seen her do in 2022, where she won the title in Kona. And on the other side, Holly, it was her first ever Kona, and she was still building back into peak shape after becoming a mother not that long ago. Now, those behind would have gotten the splits at this point as they were in transition and would be looking to close that gap as soon as possible, especially Laura and Kat. They were just wondering how far Lucy was up the road, knowing that their strengths mostly lay on the bike and the run, and especially for those two on the run. Kat had been reported saying she was hoping to break the run course record here, but also I guarantee you she was wanting to see just how fast she could ride her bike after working now for quite a while with time trial specialist Alex Dowsett. It wasn't a good start to the ride for her, getting snafu'd in transition here with, it looked like the ice might have frozen over inside her helmet, struggling to get that clipped on and get going. So she would have a bit of work to do right away up that first hill to get back to the group that she was with, where she likely knew she would probably be spending most of the day with. So from there, Lucy didn't lose any time going through town on her own, and behind her, all the groups would have to start to figure out how to work together, determine their hierarchies, who would move to the front, who would move to the back, and who would be doing most of the work. And immediately in the first group, Chelsea Sodaro looked really strong moving to the front, but unfortunately for her, her day would only begin to unravel from there. Laura Phillip would then move to the front of that bigger chase group, the second chase group, and Solveig Løvseth would move in just behind her. Also, Lisa Perder, making her Kona debut, was in a good position with them as well. So Lucy heading back up Polani, about to head out onto the highway where the majority of the ride takes place, was in familiar territory where she'd been in 2023. Although I bet she was thinking a little bit more about Taylor Knibbs, because it wasn't her first race in Kona anymore, and she knows the bike power she has, so she was probably expecting to see her at some point on the bike ride. The rest of the women at this point, at the early stage of the bike, had started to figure out their positions in the ride. Taylor, for example, had dropped her group. Kat Matthews had made her way impressively back within touch of that second chase group, and they were set for the long, arduous trip onto the Queen K, where it was a little bit windy and getting a lot hotter by the minute, which meant aid stations were going to play a crucial part in this race. And when everybody saw Taylor mess up this first aid station quite badly, not getting any water, it was a bit of an ominous sign. Lucy, on the other hand, seemed to be really efficient in the aid stations and actually had some really interesting technology on her bike where she had water activated cooling bar tape, as well as the foam in her cockpit was also water activated cooling technology. So you would see her spraying her cockpit, which I've never seen anybody else do on this Kona course before. Now, as you can see from this image, the packs behind Lucy and Taylor were quite large. As athletes fell off of that front pack, they were absorbed into the pack with Kat and Laura and Solveig. And even though that might seem like such an advantage to have so many athletes riding in a line, all at 12 meters, we know how much of a draft advantage that has. However, the dynamics in these packs aren't always great. And when you have to keep the 12 meters, you have to keep the race ranger light happy, especially with all the technical officials hanging around these big groups, it can actually be more of a hindrance than a help. As you can see from some of these images, where actually Laura had to get on the brakes and then was going back and forth before finally being able to commit to the overtake, which meant that they were only losing more and more time, a lot more than we would have expected, to the front of the race. But not long into this bike ride, the first disaster would strike. Chelsea Sodaro having to pull out after reportedly suffering from nausea and vomiting after the swim, not able to keep any of her nutrition down. And in these course conditions, it is just almost impossible to continue. So another heartbreaking result for Chelsea in what's been a really tough year. But the next big moment of the race came before the halfway mark, and that was when Solveig Løvseth, out of nowhere, took a turn at the front of her group, which was whittling down slowly but surely. And then she looked behind her and was surprised when she realized nobody else was with her. And she said, either this is really stupid or this is going to work out. And as we'll find out later on, it certainly did. So that meant she was the one keeping the gap closest to Lucy and Taylor, which was beginning to blow out to 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes at this point as they came around Hawaii, which is really where a lot of people say this race begins. And impressively at this point, Taylor had caught up to Lucy and left us with the big question of whether she would continue on with that momentum and try to drop Lucy, get a head start onto the run, or would she try and work with Lucy so they could get as much time together away from the likes of Kat and Laura and Solveig behind them. But shortly after catching up, Taylor stopped for her special needs bag to make sure she was playing the race smart, getting in a couple fresh water bottles full of nutrition, and had the work to do again to catch back up to her. But this was probably a smart decision from Taylor. Again, it's such a long, hot day out there in Kona. She also messed up a couple of those aid stations, so definitely even more crucial for her to stop and get those liquids on board. And it didn't take too much longer for her to catch back up to Lucy. And again, we were wondering, is Taylor going to take advantage of this and break away from Lucy? However, that wasn't to be the case. Even though she got a bit of a gap at times, Lucy was back to the front of the race again. And by the way the splits were going out further and further, it looked like these two were biking their way into first or second place. And honestly, at this point, it was anybody's guess because Taylor's marathon was a bit of an unknown leading into this, only having run a couple before, and they didn't really go too well. But we know how fast she is capable of running after being a short course athlete for so long. And then Lucy, while she'd been running better than ever leading up into the race, saying that this was the first year she'd really run injury-free for the entire year. So yeah, it was anybody's guess at that point, but it was really surprising just how big their gap was. 12, 13 minutes on Kat and Laura, who we know are some of the strongest cyclists in our sport. And I wonder if at this point they were regretting not being able to go with Solveig, who was limiting the gap, if not shrinking it coming back from Hawaii. And it's just mind-blowing to think that she was able to do this in her first ever Ironman World Championships at such a young age. She was looking like she might have secured the podium spot, knowing how good her run is too. But then out of nowhere, the next drama came as it was announced on the broadcast that Lucy picked up a 1-minute unintentional littering penalty for dropping a water bottle outside of a litter zone. So she quickly had to stop for that at the next penalty tent, which didn't seem to faze her too much. She was even smiling a little bit, able to refill one of her water bottles before she was underway again. But that gave Taylor that head start that she probably would have dreamed of heading into this race, able to start the marathon at her own pace, not having to go with Lucy at the start, not having to chase, and picking up all of that energy from the spectators as the leader of the Ironman World Championships. Lucy then was off the bike a minute and a half behind with a slower dismount as she typically does, and then set off to catch Taylor. Both of these women at this point looked so good starting the marathon. They looked fresh, they looked present, and their pace reflected it, starting off really hot. But behind them was Solveig Loveseth, who was next in line to chase them down. She had an unbelievable ride, finishing just 5.5 minutes back in the end from Taylor and just 4 minutes from Lucy. And with the run being her strength, really anything could happen here. But the first person that I heard to call her from the win was McKeely Jones, a lot earlier on the bike, actually asked to make a bold prediction on air and picked Solveig for the win. She clearly knew something that the rest of us didn't. But next into transition was Kat and Laura. Incredibly, another 8.5 minutes back from Solveig, which meant they were about 14 minutes back from Taylor overall. And yes, even though they were potentially in run course record shape, that meant Taylor would have to run around a 3:01 marathon, or Lucy would have to run around a 2:59, and that at this point looked highly unlikely. So as these athletes ran on a leaky drive, they might have been startled by just how hot it was. Again, been here a couple years. This was by far the hottest I'd ever felt it. There wasn't too much wind. The air just felt still, hot, and extremely humid. And these ladies definitely set off at a hot pace. And at this point of the run, it's so interesting because with the U-turn, you get a chance to see each other. You've gotten a lot of splits at this point after having such a long, lonely bike ride. And yeah, you're really excited at this point to get as close to that finish line as possible. Now, we did see a couple moments here early on where Solveig had to stop and she rolled down her calf sleeve, so a bit of a scare there. And then Lucy stopped to adjust her shoes. She might have tightened them a little too tight out of transition, but that probably gave her a little bit of a breather, slowed her down through the aid station, and she was still making inroads into Taylor. Solveig was holding the gap to them. She wasn't really making any inroads, so at this point it looked like she was probably just going to be fighting for that podium position with Kat and Laura flying behind her. But then we got to the 10K mark in the famous Polani climb before the athletes go out onto the Queen K. Again, this is where the last time they'll see a lot of spectators for quite a while, and this is where Lucy made her pass on Taylor. She didn't want to stick around and hang around with Taylor's pace. She pressed on quite fast through this last aid station before the highway, and it looked like this might be her winning move to regain her title from 2023. But Solveig behind was running incredibly well, although she did say after the race the beginning of the marathon was the hardest part for her, saying she wasn't sure whether she could finish. But at this point she was holding a great pace. Kat and Laura were making time into her, but again, with that 8.5 minute gap that they had to her at the beginning of the bike ride, it wasn't really making a dent. And further behind them, all the other ladies were losing time to the front of the race, but they still had a lot to fight for. There was still a chance of a top 5. There was also all the Pro Series points on the line, which for the likes of Marta Sanchez, as well as Lisa Perderer, was definitely a main objective coming into this race, with the added 1,000 points on offer for it being a World Championships. But back to the front of the race, and these two were not thinking about the Pro Series at all. They were thinking about the win. And at first, it looked like Lucy had it in the bag. In fact, Taylor shared after the race that, yeah, she thought that was title number 2 for Lucy. But she also shared that it is incredible that they both have the exact same coach, Dan Lorang, and they do totally different workouts. And they have such a different background in the sport, how they got into the sport, yet somehow here they are at the exact same spot on course, running side by side after Taylor caught back up to Lucy when she was struggling walking a little bit through the aid stations. So it looked like the momentum was back in the favor of Taylor, but we've seen so many people walk aid stations before in Kona and just cool their body temperature down, and they're able to keep going again. But Lucy didn't quite look the same after that, and amazingly, even though Taylor looked better and came up alongside her, Lucy fought hard not to let her go, and they ran side by side for quite a bit until the next aid station. But behind them, Solveig was looking the best. She, in fact, said after the race that around this halfway point, she was feeling good. She was feeling a lot better, and it started to show. She looked the best runner aside from Kat at this point in the race. Then, at that next aid station, when Lucy stopped again, it didn't look as good as the last one. She began to wobble a little bit, not walk in a straight line, taking on everything she could. But with that much highway in front of her, and with Taylor running well and getting further and further away, it really must have been so mentally difficult. She kept looking behind her. She was clearly just trying to salvage what she could from this race, and still somehow kept fighting back and kept trying to run. At the next aid station then, Taylor was able to grab her special needs bottle and still looked like she was moving good on course, whereas Lucy just kept deteriorating. And it was at this point where we got one of the worst visuals of the entire race, and the gasps heard in the media room where I was were significant. And I'm sure it was in every living room of people watching this race around the world. It was incredibly tough to watch, and it's one of the most brutal parts of our sport where you are technically not allowed to receive any outside assistance. It is a solo sport, so when somebody's really struggling like this, you just want to run out there and help them, but you have to let them keep going in case there's any hope that they can get to the finish line. But at this point, I think it was clear. We all knew that this wasn't going to happen for Lucy, even though she kept on trying. Amazingly though, behind her, Solveig kept on gaining time to Taylor. She was looking great, and then Kat was gaining time to both Taylor and Solveig, but it looked like she had given herself just too much work to overcome off of the bike, although she was running at run course record pace and was looking better and better as the race went on. But then flashback to Lucy, and all of a sudden we saw her coach and husband Reese on the side of the road and holding out his arm, signaling for Lucy to stop. He decided it was time to pull her off course and get her to safety as soon as possible. There was a medical van there waiting for her, and that is definitely the same decision I would have made in his shoes, not wanting to risk any long-term damage or health effects, as Lucy clearly had a long way still to go and probably was only going to get worse. But that meant Solveig had moved up into second place by default, and Kat Matthews into third. And amazingly, Solveig's time to Taylor was coming down, and Kat Matthews' time to Solveig was coming down as well. So it looked like it actually might be a close finish, but still with 3.5 miles to go and Taylor having a 2.5 minute lead at this point, it just didn't seem like the math was adding up until all of a sudden she started to look like Lucy did at the aid station. All of a sudden, walking through it, staggering, trying to get as much water and ice on her as possible, but it wasn't looking good. And crazy enough, all of us were at the finish line ready for her. We all thought it was over. I'm sure graphics were made and articles were written about Taylor winning her first Ironman World Championships, and yet here we were. Solveig was coming. Taylor was clearly thinking about her because he was still moving as fast as he could through the aid station and got back running again. Somehow, I have no idea how her and Lucy kept managing to fight through what they were going through to try and get to that finish line. But sadly for her, at the next aid station, it all started to unravel, and she began to wobble across the road and really stagger. And unfortunately, we have seen this many times before in Kona, where it just all seems to add up by the end of the race, and there's literally nothing you can do at this point. Your body starts shutting down. And I can tell you, we were all at the finish line waiting for Taylor at this point, which makes these next scenes some of the most shocking that I've ever had to watch in any sport, knowing how much Taylor has put into this race, how much Kona is the dream for her. She knows all the history of this race, and it was just brutal to watch because she clearly needed help at this point. But everybody knows that rule where they aren't allowed outside assistance, and I guess just hope for some miracle that she is able to get back up and get going again. But it definitely wasn't to be, and that meant Solveig was running past her shortly afterwards. She asked her if she was okay, but again, nothing much she could do at that point, and she found herself for the first time in the race leading the Ironman World Championships on debut. And you thought she had it in the bag, but then all of a sudden, when you check the timing splits, Kat had made up a significant amount of time and was just a minute down heading into this final stretch down Elite Drive. Could Solveig hold on? Yes, she could. Just finishing 35 seconds up on Kat. She became the youngest athlete since 1986 to win the women's race, with the third smallest margin of victory in Kona history, becoming the fourth Norwegian to win the World Championships on debut after Christian, Gustav, and Casper recently in Nice. Thanks to Triathlon Insights for those stats there. And that meant Kat finished just behind her in second place, her third second place at the Ironman World Championship, despite taking a minute off the run course record. She was gracious in defeat though, and was so happy for Solveig. And then Laura Philipp rounded out the podium. Not her day, but still to pick up another third place, her second third place finish in Kona. It was an impressive performance. But almost even more impressive was Hannah Berry's career best fourth place result and Lisa Perder's 5th place on debut, picking up some decent Pro Series points. But that is your women's top 5 from this year's World Championships. What a race it was. I would love to hear your opinion about it down below. I'm happy to report Lucy and Taylor are okay. And I'm so glad after they gave us so much drama that I'm sure none of us will likely forget about this race in our lifetime. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.